Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Cafe Oleh. My name is Jay. I'm a volunteer with Nefesh B'Nefesh. I myself made Aliyah with Nefesh B'Nefesh. And here at Cafe Oleh, we go over the everyday Hebrew you need here in Israel to survive and, if not, succeed. Whether it's learning how to read your utility bills, going grocery shopping and reading nutritional labels, striking up a conversation, going on a date, going on a job interview, keeping up with the news, everyday things that you would do in your respective countries of origin and your respective mother tongues, but here in Israel and in Hebrew. We focus more on intro level because we know that's often a point where a lot of people find a lot of frustration in that they're just learning the language, but they want the vocabulary that they use in everyday life in English or whatever language they otherwise use. So that's what we're focusing on here. Very practical Hebrew, intro level, don't have to come with much background behind you. We'll explain it all. As always, we want to hear from you what topics you'd like us to cover that we haven't already. Please check us out on youtube.com. You can see all of our previous webinars are up there by just typing in Cafe Oleh or Nefesh B'Nefesh. You'll see a playlist. All of our previous sessions are there, including this one will be up in the next few days. So you can go and watch it at your leisure, go back on it, review it, however you'd like. If you have suggestions for future lessons, please write them in the chat window here on Zoom or email us directly at Nefesh B'Nefesh. And if you have any questions as I'm going through this lesson, as we are quite a lot of people, we're currently at 110 people on this call, on this webinar, please write in the Q&A. I'm only going to be looking at the Q&A in this lesson, not the chat. So if you have questions about this specific lesson, Q&A, anything else, requests for topics, comments, questions, concerns, please write that in the chat. Okay. Now, let's get started by wishing a happy birthday. Last week, or just over a week ago, the Academy for the Hebrew Language introduced new words to the Hebrew language. That's a big deal. We've talked about this before, that language is ever evolving. Hebrew is ever evolving, not just from its 4,000-year-old plus roots, but also in using its roots, but also looking towards the future. And what words do we need to fill in the gaps of an otherwise ancient language, a religious language, a language that wasn't used for everyday life by Jews throughout the diaspora until very recently? What words do we need to fill it in? Just like other languages around the world, particularly French and German and Spanish, Israel, being the home of the most Hebrew speakers in the world, has a national institute. It's called Ha'Akademia Lashon Ha'ivrit, the Academy for the Hebrew Language. And their job is to standardize Hebrew, right? They codify the Hebrew grammar that we use on a regular basis or don't use, and they come up with new words, right? So instead of using an English word to describe something, and we're going to look at a few examples in a minute, their task is to come up with Hebrew words that may or may not be adopted by the public, right? Just because it's proper English doesn't mean that we use it. Same thing with Hebrew. The Academia is a great website. We're going to post it in the notes in the YouTube section. You can also just look it up in Google, type in the Academy for the Hebrew Language. They have a great social media account, by the way, both on Instagram and on Facebook, with great visuals and really funny insights into the Hebrew language. They do a thing about names and the origins of names and the meanings of names. They do it about common grammatical mistakes, and they talk about new words. So every year there's a new list of words that come out. This isn't like the Oxford Dictionary that comes out with the word of the year. These are brand new words that are needed for the 21st century. So what we're going to do today is going to go through some of these words together and understand, more importantly, why they are created, their origin, and how they fit into Hebrew. That's a really important part. And we've talked about this before, and we're actually going to review it right now as I share my screen. A really important key to understanding Hebrew, which is this. Let me just open up my screen here. As always, you are welcome to screenshot old school pen and paper like you would in a classroom. We just happen to be online. And as well, the recording will go up in the next few days on YouTube, so you can follow along if you don't know how to screenshot or you don't want to write out the words. We've talked about this before, right? Hebrew is 7th grade algebra. X times Y equals XY. If you can keep that in your head while you learn Hebrew, you have mastered 90% of the language. Why? Because as you see here at the top, and I wrote this both in Hebrew and English, and I haven't seen many people explain it as simply as this. And I think this really is a game changer for many of us learning the language, right? X times Y equals XY. X in this case is the shoresh. Y is the binyan or mishkal. I'm going to explain all of this in a little bit. And optionally adding a netiya. You put these three things together and you get a milah, a word. Shoresh, it means root, R-O-O-T. It's the three letters that make up the vast majority of words in Hebrew, okay? All words in Hebrew have a root. Some have two, some have four, but the vast majority have three. They have to be in a very specific order, right? We've talked about this before. In Hebrew, spelling is destiny. Just because two letters sound alike does not mean you can sub them out. You have to spell things correctly. Otherwise, both the meaning and the conjugation of it are lost. The second part, the Y in the X times Y, is called the binyan or the mishkal. We've talked about this a lot in our previous lessons. You can go back and see them on YouTube as well. These are the formats. These are how you plug in the root, the shoresh, into a formatted construct. Think of, I'll give you an example shortly, but basically binyan literally means building. And binyan refers to the forms that are used for verbs. There are 7 of them in Hebrew. And the mishkal is used for nouns and adjectives. Mishkal literally means weight, W-E-I-G-H-T, not weight like in weight. And there are many, many mishkalim in Hebrew. Mishkalim is the plural of mishkal. I'm actually going to show you really quick some of these. The binyanim we've gone through before, 7 of them, but mishkal, there's a lot. I'm going to show you actually in just a second, but I want to give you an example of how this works. X times Y equals XY in Hebrew. Take the root, the shoresh, tzadi, lem, lamed, mem. Okay, tzadi, lamed, mem. Okay, those 3 letters in that specific form, as you see here in the English, have the general meaning of image. Okay, something along the lines of an image. Those of you with a religious background know B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, that all humans are created. There are lots of different words for this. Litzalem means to photograph. Lihitztalem is to be photographed. Has to do something with image. Okay, so that's the shoresh, that's the X. Now the Y is the mishkal. Okay, the letter Y, not Y. Mishkal is the format, the plugin that we're going to put this root in. And in this case, it's maktela. When we talk about mishkalim, nouns and adjectives, we use the letters kuf, tet, lamed as placeholders. And then we plug in the shoresh into those 3 letters. And then we use the dots and bars, meaning nikud, the vowel sounds, as well as any helper letters, in this case, mem and hey, to come up with a new word. So the mishkal here, the format, is maktela. And maktela, as you see here on the right, has to do with tools, utensils, something that we physically use. So we combine these 2 functions of Hebrew, right? The shoresh that generally means image, and the mishkal that generally means a tool, right? A tool to create an image is a matzlema, right? It's the combination of tzadi lamed mem and the mishkal maktela. We put these 2 together, X times Y equals XY. In this case, matzlema. Matzlema, a camera. Obviously, there were no cameras in biblical and medieval times. This is a modern word using a pre-existing shoresh, tzadi lamed mem, and a pre-existing mishkal, a pre-existing mold for nouns and adjectives, in this case, maktela. Put the 2 together, matzlema. Okay, that's it. That is the entirety of understanding how Hebrew words are created, and by extension, creating new words. Let's look at some words that we've already gone through in the past that we've created. And then we're going to look at some of the new words that have just come out, the fresh words of Tafshin Mem Bet or 2021 to 2022. Tafshin Pebet, excuse me. Okay. This is a great one. Biush. And as you see here, as always, the Hebrew is in the middle with the dots and bars meeting nikud, or the vowel sounds, because we don't have letters that indicate vowel sounds in Hebrew. Transliteration on the right, English on the left. And then I've added 2 extra columns here that I normally don't, but we're talking about new words. And it's important to understand when we look at words, we always have to think about the shoresh and the mishkal. Just like we did with matzlema, we're going to do that with each of these. Okay, so we have here biush. Biush means shaming, right? In modern day language, we talk about shaming online, shaming in person, and we use the root bet yud shin. You see that over here in row 2, right? On the left-hand side, column B. Bet yud shin has a general meaning of shame. Okay, from this we get words for shame and embarrassment and to be embarrassed and to embarrass someone. In this case, we have the word taking the mishkal, in this case, kitul. We plug it in here with the root bet yud shin, and we get the word biush. Okay, it means shaming, the act of shaming someone. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. When we construct words in Hebrew, there always has these 2 aspects, shoresh and mishkal. And if it's a verb, shoresh and binyan. Let's look at another one. This is one of the classics. And this is one of the classics when we talk about the role of the Academy for Hebrew Language in modern Israeli society. Did you know there's a word for internet in Hebrew? It is not internet, it is mirshetet or mirshetet, depending how you say the letter resh, right? Mirshetet comes from the root resh shin taf. You see this over here on the left. And that has words that are connected to chain or net or network. And from that, the Academy created in the mid-90s the word mirshetet. Now, you will never hear, you will rarely hear someone say in everyday conversation in modern Israel the word mirshetet. Again, that's what standardizing a language takes into account. Some words will be adopted, some words won't. Mirshetet is a great example of a word that is not adopted, right? It exists. If you go onto the Academy's website, it's there. People know it, and they'll often use it jokingly. No one ever uses it in everyday life. If you're reading the news, if you're watching a government spokes event, or if you're in an academic situation, or even in just work or talking to people, you're going to say internet, or you might even say reshet, because reshet means a net or network, just like internet. But mirshetet, this word that was specifically created for the internet, we don't use so much. Here's another word. We've talked about this one before. I love this word, nayeret. Nayeret takes the root nun yud resh, which has to do with paper. Niyar is paper. Niyar is paper. And it takes the mishkal kaletet. Kaletet, we've talked about many times before, indicates illness, sickness. So you plug in paper into illness, you get paperwork, nayeret. Nayeret is the Hebrew word for paperwork. This is a great example of using Hebrew grammar and a little bit of creativity to come up with a very modern phenomenon, nayeret, paperwork. I want to stop here before we get to the new words, just to show you why some of these mishkalim are a little bit more complicated to show you. Let's see the longer list. This is the longer list. Okay, so there's a couple reasons why we, when you are learning Hebrew, you actually don't learn the mishkalim. You learn the binyanim. You learn those plug-in formats for verbs, because there's only 7 of them. And to understand how verbs work in Israel and Hebrew, you have to know those. Mishkalim, however, for nouns and adjectives, there are a lot of them. Not only are there a lot of them, as you see here, this is just an example, a sample of them. This is a page for getting ready for the Bagrut. The Bagrut is the matriculation exams that high school students take at the end of their studies. This is just a small example of them. And you can see not only are there a lot of them, there's already here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. These are 9. Then it gets even trickier because then you have ones like here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that have multiple meanings, right? And then you get into issues of, well, it doesn't quite fit. I don't know which one to pick. There's a reason why this isn't taught, but at the same time, it's a detriment to not understand how Hebrew works so simply on 7th grade algebra level that at the very least to recognize these mishkalim. We'll add this as a link into the YouTube recording when it goes up in the next few days. Don't worry, and there's also one on Wikipedia we'll add as well. Just know that these exist. Very few people learn these, and with good reason, because there are so many of them, but also because they have multiple meanings, it's a little tricky to do them. We've covered some. So for example, kaletet, like we talked about before. Let's see if they added it here. They didn't, but kaletet, here it is, right? Kaletet, we just talked about nayeret, right? Kaletet is the mishkal that you see here, but you also see under mashma'ut hora'ah, which means mashma'ut means meaning, hora'ah instruction, that it has 3 different possible meanings. It can be machalot, sickness, osfim, collections, or ba'alot mikzoa, people who are who are masters of certain crafts, of certain professions. It's profession titles, right? Like a ganenet is a female kindergarten teacher, or a zameret is a female singer, right? Those are not illnesses, and those are not collections of things. So it's a little tricky with this one, which is why it's seldom taught in class. With that being said, let's go back to some of, not all the words that have been created for this coming year. Some of these are great, and I'm adding the ones we're going to go through. Sorry, just one second. The ones we're going to go through are the words that I think are the most relevant, both in terms of everyday conversation, keeping up with the news, but also Anglo-Olim, by and large, we're middle class, we're white collar, we have high education. These are words that you're probably using in English already. You should know what they are in Hebrew. And I'm going to explain why they're here and why I did not put the original version as well as I go through each of these, and you're going to understand really quickly why. Let's start with this, a censor, right? The person who is in charge of censoring something, material, words, language, things like that. The Academy for the Hebrew Language has created a word for this. Why? Because I didn't put it here. What's the word that's been used right now? Censor, right? Censor is great in that if you understand English, you understand censor. If you speak Hebrew, you're not necessarily going to know what that word means, except that when you hear it in context. But the new word that's just been created in Hebrew, if you speak Hebrew, you'll understand completely. What's the word for censor, according to the Academy for Hebrew Language? Ganzar. Ganzar or ganzarit if you are a woman. Ganzar comes from the root, as you see here on the left-hand side, Gimel Nun Zain. Gimel Nun Zain has to do with burying something, a material thing, an object, not a person, not even an animal, but those of you who come from a religious background, for example, you know what a gniza is. That's a repository for holy objects, books, anything that has God's name written in it, and other holy items that need to be buried because of their holiness after their use or their irrepair. Right? Ganzal comes from that same root, and we've modified it for the 21st century to mean a censor, the person who buries something, right? That's the meaning behind it. And that's what you're going to keep seeing in all these words. Next one, capitalism. Up until now, in economics, in history books, in international relations, in the news, what word do we use? Capitalism. Great, again, if you understand that word from non-Hebrew, but we need a word in Hebrew, and a word that Hebrew speakers will immediately understand because of the shoresh on the one hand and the mishkal on the other. What did they create? Hontanut. I love this word. This is a great word. Hontanut. What is hontanut? It is hon, and then the mishkal that gives us hontanut. Hon in Hebrew means capital, a large sum of money or wealth, Okay, that word we use all the time in business, hon, right? Anyone who does business in Israel or any aspects of business, indirectly like legals or marketing, knows the word hon. So from that, also honna'a, which is related, which means fraud. Hon tanut gives us capitalism, right? The act of acquiring capital. Not the exact definition of capitalism, let's say, but acquiring, using capital. But the point is that hon is at the center of it. Hon, capital, large amount of money. Shlomanut. Shlomanut is the new word for pacifism. Why? Because the previous word was pacifism. So instead of saying pacifism, and again, you know those words, right? I didn't write them out here, but you know those words when you are reading an article in Hebrew or you're reading online, and all of a sudden you get to a word that doesn't look like Hebrew. It's really hard to pronounce. It's hard to pronounce for native Hebrew speakers too, because it's not Hebrew. But shlomanut, that's something that a native Hebrew speaker will be easily able to read and then quickly figure out what it means, not just by context, but because of the shoresh and the mishkal. Shlomanut, pacifism. This comes from the same root as shalom, peace. Shlomanut, that ut at the end or manut at the end of a word indicates a movement or a philosophy of idea, or an idea in general is usually what's conveyed in this specific mishkal. Okay, so shlomanut, pacifism. Our next word, hechsem. This is a great word because up till now we've been saying embargo, or we've been saying itzumim. We talked about itzumim last week, and last week about the news with regards to the teachers' strike, and that they were imposing itzumim, sanctions, work disputes over their wages. Hechsem is an embargo, right? So when we talk about the war of Russia on Ukraine, we keep using the word itzumim, sanctions, with regards to what the West is doing onto Russia in retaliation, or embargo. In this case, now we have a Hebrew word, hechsem, and hechsem makes complete sense to a native Hebrew speaker. Why? Because the root of hechsem is chet samech mem. Chet samech mem means to block something. Right? A machsom is a checkpoint. Lachsom is to block something. This is a verb that we also use with regards to cybersecurity, to block a cyber attack. Lachsom. This verb is used all the time. The way is shut. Nechsam. Okay, so hechsem makes complete sense to be embargo, understanding both, again, shoresh, mishkal. Another great one. Kishrur or kishrur. Kishrur, legitimacy. Instead of saying legitimatia, which again, it's not that all of the world's Hebrew speakers are automatically adopting these words just like that. You didn't get a memo in your mail, I didn't either, right? These were all announced in the news, but we're not being asked to use these on force. These are recommended. And it's a trial to see which ones get adopted, like we said with milshetet. Some of these make a lot of sense. Some of these perhaps not. Kishrur, I like. Kishrur is legitimacy. It comes from the root kaf shin resh. Many of you know this word from kasher, kosher. Kosher, however, because it's kasher in Hebrew, but kosher in Hebrew actually means fitness. A chedo kosher is a gym. It's a room of fitness, literally. Okay, kishrur takes the specific mishkal kitlul, which is a very common one that you hear a lot in Hebrew, kitlul, plugs in the shoresh kaf shin resh, gets the word kishrur, and it takes the word for fit, that the shoresh that generally means to train or to fit something, and creates the word legitimacy, right? If something's legitimate, it's fit for use. Kishrur, legitimacy. Something being in the state of being legitimate. Something in the state of being legitimate. Doesn't need too many beings in there. The opposite of kishrur, hafsala. This one is such a no-brainer to a Hebrew speaker, because this one makes complete sense also. Hafsalah. Hafsalah has the shoresh of Pei Samech Lamed, which means to nullify. Something that's pasul is null. And then it takes the root, the mishkal, the format, haktzala, which is also related to a verb form that has to do with causation, to cause something to become something else. In this case, to cause something to be delegitimized. So the act of delegitimization or delegitimation, I think, is another way to say it. It's a very complicated word in English to say. In Hebrew, it's a lot easier to say. So instead of now saying delegitimatia, which is quite complicated for anyone to say, we can now simply say hafsalah. And hafsalah, the act of making something pasul, the act of making something null to delegitimize it. Great word. Next one, malhigut. This is a tricky one, and I spent some time looking up what this could possibly be made from. Malhigut is demagoguery. Instead of saying demagogia, we now have the word malhigut. I want to take a venture and say that malhigut is comprised of a combination of things. We have the word manhigut with a nun at the beginning. Manhigut means leadership. Malhigut also potentially has the root he gimel he, which both means a steering wheel, hege, but it also means to edit or to utter or to pronounce or to control something. And the idea of demagoguery, right, is to control the masses with your pronunciation, with your eloquence, and rile up the masses for your own good, not necessarily for their own good, and not necessarily for the larger society's good. So demagoguery instead of demagogia, malhigut. It's a very interesting word. I need to look into that one a little bit more. Miskam. Miskam is a really interesting word. We have so many words with this shoresh. Samech kaf mem. You've heard this one all the time. Samech kaf mem, as a general meaning, as a shoresh, as you see here on the left-hand side, has to do with sum, S-U-M, concluding, agreeing, convincing in the sense of agreement. You get this word a lot, right? Like schum is the total sum of something when you're paying, for example, at a restaurant or at a grocery store. Lisakem means to conclude. Lahaskim means to agree. And taking this root, we then, instead of saying consensus, we simply say miskam for consensus. Miskam is the new word we're being asked to adopt for the word consensus instead of the cognate consensus. Remember, a lot of the reasons we're creating these words, just like other languages do, is because we don't want to rely on another language to convey our own thoughts, right? We don't want to keep using a cognate from English or other languages to convey something that happens here in Israel among Hebrew speakers. That's why the Academy exists. That's why the Academy puts out these words every year, these new words every year. This is an interesting one. Why it didn't exist before, I'm not sure. Instead of paradigma, we now have tfusa. Tfusa comes from the root daled pe samech, which means a pattern. It also means a print, both a print like on something, but also print as in to print something in a machine. Lahadpis means to print. It also can mean to publish. Tfus is a word for publishing or publication. Tfusa, a paradigm. Right? It's something that is a pattern. It's an ongoing pattern that you can relate back to or fit in something into. Instead of paradigma now, we have tfusa. Okay, got a few more here. We're going to switch shortly from the social sciences and international relations to health, I promise. There's a little bit of diversity in what they did, but most of the words that came out this year were biology words, and they had to do with specific species of, I believe it was some plants and some mosquitoes. You don't need to know those. I don't need to know those for sure. And the others were the social sciences and health. This is a great one. Adatiyut. Adatiyut, ethnicity. Okay, so instead of saying ethni, right, or the various other ways that we refer to an ethnic people, which we do in Hebrew, we say eda a lot. And eda in older Hebrew means a community. In modern Hebrew, it refers to a community with regards to your ethnicity, specifically with regards to Israeli Jews. What diaspora community they come from? What's their minhag? What's their religious custom? Right? So Edah is a really important word. We talk about this a lot, unfortunately, still in Israeli society, how we're still plagued by thinking of each other in our different Edot, our different diaspora communities, and thus our differences on that level. Adatiut, ethnicity. Okay, and this is a word that's used, this is planning to be used for ethnicities around the world. The root, Ein Vav Dalid, has to do with testifying or encouraging or certificates, but it's most related to the word Edah. Edah means a community, specifically an ethnic group, is the best way to describe Edah outside of a Jewish context. Adatiut makes a lot of sense in that respect. Okay, this one is not a, is no longer creating a new word out of scratch. Rather, it's taking existing words and putting them together. And we have a couple examples of that coming up. Instead of saying filibuster, filibuster for filibuster, we can now say ne'um hatasha. It's not that we couldn't say ne'um hatasha before, it's that someone didn't think about it and then standardize it so that everyone, whenever we're talking about a filibuster, because we talk about that so often, though we do if you read the news enough, both here in Israel and around the world, there needs to be a word for it. And filibuster in its new form, not the cognate filibuster, makes a lot of sense. Ne'um hatasha. Ne'um is a speech. Lin'om is to give a speech. Ne'um is a speech. Hatasha is attrition, or to make something go super slow. Tashush is exhausted. Hatasha is attrition, like Milchemet Hatasha, the war of attrition that took place in the late 60s, early 70s, along the Sinai-Israel border. Ne'um Hatasha, filibuster, right? Because that's what a filibuster is. Really interesting way that they put that together, very creative. Give them a lot of props at the Academy for that. Next word, nepotism. Instead of saying nepotism, and unfortunately that's a phenomenon here in Israel too, hadafat krovim. Again, native Hebrew speaker, this makes complete sense. Instead of saying nepotism, hadafat krovim. Hadafa means preference. Okay, it comes from the root ein daled pei. Adif is preferred or superior to. Laha'adif al is to prefer something. Hadafa is a preference. So hadafat krovim. Krovim in this case means relatives. Krovei mishpacha are relatives. Krov mishpacha, taking the word karov, close to, someone who is close to a family. Okay, that's what it's referring to here as krovim, not just close. We're talking about nepotism here, so it has to be even closer than just friends. It can be friends, but it's usually also family members. Hadafat krovim, a preference for those close to us, i.e. family or family friends, nepotism. Great new word. Hopefully you don't have to use this or hear this word, but it's a good one to know. Last one here in this category, politika metziutanit. This one's great. Instead of saying realpolitik, unfortunately very familiar here in Israel, instead of saying realpolitik, you can now say politika metziutanit. Politika, unfortunately, we don't have a word yet that the Academy has created for politics that is taken off. So we say politika. Metziutanit. Metziut in modern Hebrew means reality. And so to turn that into realistic is basically the meaning of metziutanit, realistic politics or realpolitik, metziutanit. So politika metziutanit, realpolitik, instead of saying realpolitik. Sorry, that's one of my favorites also. Okay, let's get to some biology terms. Shmenut. Shmenut is obesity. There are words that have been used before. There's words for overweight, hashmanat yeter, but shmenut is obesity. Unfortunately, it is a growing phenomenon here in Israel. And so they wanted a word in Hebrew to describe it, not just to say obesity or just write it out even in English. As much as The medical system here in Israel is trained in English. They wanted a word as well for society, much less patients to be able to use. Shmenut is obesity, and it comes from the root shin mem nun, which in olden days and still to this day referred to oil and also fat, like fat on an animal. And so now we use it as well like that. So shemen is oil, shuman is fat, but shamen is fat as an adjective. And now we have the word shmenut, a noun, meaning obesity. Another great word, levadut. Levadut, solitude. This is not loneliness. This is not anything else. This is solitude. A really nice word to have, especially in the noise and clamor that Israel can be. Levadut. Levadut comes from the root bet dalid dalid, from which we get boded, like a chayal boded, a lone soldier, a soldier who does not have family here, usually olim, but can also be someone whose family just isn't in a position to support them or supports their enlistment. Boded can also be alone. Badad is the name of a very famous song here in Israel by Zohar Algov, Badad. Levad means alone. From this same root, we get levadut, solitude, being alone. Not any judgment on it. You're not lonely. You're in solitude. Okay. Another one, we've talked about this word actually a lot in the past 2 years. And there are previous lessons on this. We're not going to go into any of the words related to corona and diseases in this class. We have used this word as a noun. Now we get to use it as an adjective, which in Hebrew we've talked about before. It is really simple to make an adjective out of a noun. All you have to do is add a yud at the end. So from the word tasmin, we've talked about the word tasmin before, symptom, we get the word tasmini, symptomatic. Just like in English, right? Symptom is the noun, symptomatic is the adjective. So tasmini, symptomatic, instead of saying symptomi. Why we ever said that? Because we had tasmin already, symptom. Now we can say tasmini, symptomatic. Now we have itas tasmini. Instead of asymptomati or asymptomatic in English, we now have itasmini. So tasmini, symptomatic, itasmini, asymptomatic. That e at the beginning in Hebrew indicates a or un or non. Think of the expression efshal. It's impossible. Okay, taking the word efshal, adding it to the beginning of it, e with a dash, like you see here with itasmini, it means impossible, from the impossible. Itasmini, asymptomatic instead of symptomatic. Great word to know when describing an illness or going to the doctor. And then finally, instead of saying machala chronit, a chronic illness, we say it a lot more simply in Hebrew, using Hebrew words just like we had before. We're not creating a new word here. We're just putting together two existing words that make a lot of sense. Machala mitmashechet. Machala is an illness. Mitmashechet means continuing or lasting, right? This root mem shin kaf, we get a lot. It means to pull or to extend or to continue in its most general sense. So from that, we get the word mitmashech, which is an everyday word that we use in Hebrew, by the way. We combine it with the word machala. We add to it the correct ending because it's a feminine word, machala. So machala mitmashechet, a chronic illness. Okay. Really interesting words that have been created, both in terms of the categories that they felt were important to do. In this case, a lot from news, current events, politics, sociology, international relations, and so forth, but also some biology, but also how they constructed the words. Again, all of these words fit the same format of shoresh plus mishkal. And the shorashim, we all know as Hebrew speakers what these words, these shorashim mean, because we know their application in other words. Like I gave you examples for each of them, as well as the mishkal. There are many more mishkalim, which is why I didn't go through each of them here. But also, once you understand the mishkal that fits with these words, you understand how the word came about. So some of those mishkalim have multiple meanings, and it was also about aesthetics, right? We've talked about aesthetics before. In Hebrew is really important. The sound of Hebrew is no less important than writing and writing it out. So sometimes certain letters and nikud, the vowel sounds, need to change in order to sound and thus be pronounceable more easily. So all those things get into account, both the shoresh, the mishkal, the need to have the importance of these words, the cultural and sociological context for creating these, and finally the sound, that these sound not just appealing to be used, but that they're easy to pronounce, because if they're not easy to pronounce, why use them? So mirshetet makes a lot of sense why it didn't take off. It's a little weird to say. Internet is just a lot, it just flows in a different way. Okay, I'm going to stop here as I see I have a bunch of questions in the Q&A. Let's open these up. Ellen says, Naira, sounds like a person who would do paperwork. Great point, Ellen. If you look back at what we just discussed, right? If you, sorry, let me just pull that up. This list of mishkalim, of the forms that nouns and adjectives can take on, you can see, just as I talked about before, that kaletet, the same form that nayeret takes, can be machalot, osfim, and balot mikzoa. Exactly what you're saying, Ellen. So kaletet as a form can mean an illness, a collection of things, or a profession. Okay, so it's why it sounds like zameret, ganenet, dayelet, a female flight attendant, but it also sounds like nazelet, a runny nose, or tsahevet, jaundice, or tsaneret, all these other words that mean illness. Okay, but great point there. It does, however, nayeret in modern Hebrew means paperwork. Okay, let me pull up the Graham, why 2 yuds in the nayeret? Is there a rule to learn? There is a rule. It is very complicated. We've talked about it in the past. It is called emot kriya in Hebrew. It has a Latin term, mater lectionis. It is a unique thing to Hebrew and Semitic languages. As I keep saying before, the dots and the bars that indicate vowel sounds, nikud. Well, as you know, in everyday Hebrew, we don't use those dots and bars. When you're reading everyday Hebrew, they aren't there. You understand the words out of their context and using them in previous situations. So nayeret, it's just not there. It's the extra yod is there to make sure that you pronounce it as nayeret. If you were not to write in that extra yod, there would be people who would pronounce it incorrectly. And I'm not going to say what it would sound like incorrectly because I don't want to get that in your head. Okay, instead it's nayeret. And it's written there. If you write it out, you will see it written out as just one yud. But if you're just learning Hebrew and you see it with one yud, you're likely going to pronounce it incorrectly. So that extra yud is what we call emot kriya. It's to ensure that you're actually pronouncing it as y and not as a vowel sound, because yud is one of a few letters that in ancient Hebrew and even in modern Hebrew can take the place of a long vowel. Very complicated. That's the easiest way to do it. Ed, I did not add a column for the mishkal. As I explained, there are many, many, many mishkalim, and they don't always follow a definite meaning, as opposed to the shorashim, which always follow the same order of letters and the same meaning. Mishkal can have multiple meanings, so it's the reason why I didn't add it there, but taken into account. Thank you for suggesting it. What is the word for illegitimate that would be used in formal writing versus the word for bastard? Illegitimate is pasul, Andrew. As I said before, with hafsalah is pasul, is the word that we use for illegitimate or void. Anonymous asks, you said that some of the words created by the Academy are not used in everyday Ivrit, like internet. What determines the success or failure of a new word? Great point. It's a reason why the Academy has such good social media now, and I highly encourage you, even if you don't read Hebrew, even if you can't, it's too intimidating, even with Google Translate being a subpar option for immediate translation skills, you should follow it because they have great infographics. They have great resources they put on. And part of that is a push to be relevant for everyday Hebrew speakers, right? They want you to know how to speak Hebrew properly. And there are a lot of campaigns that they do to ensure that. And one of their means of doing that is through social media, which is why they have such a popular following online. And it's also to ensure that their suggestions, what should become new words, are there. So that's one of them. So that's partially what determines the success failure. Do everyday Hebrew speakers take on these words or not? Do they fill a void that otherwise isn't there, right? Does it fill a void that's either used by a cognate that's too difficult to pronounce, or we just have to use too many Hebrew words to create that one meaning? Because Hebrew loves really succinct words and words with as few syllables as possible. So there's a lot of factors involved, but it mainly comes down to us as Hebrew speakers. Do we like these words or not? How aware are we that words exist? In fact, on the Academy's website, you can look on, they have a full dictionary of words that are otherwise cognates, and you can look up their quote unquote Hebrew version that they created. It's a great resource. Esther, yes, thank you for correcting me. It is katelet, not kaletet. Even I trip up on the order of letters sometimes. I'm allowed to make mistakes, but thank you for pointing that out. Okay, I never feel, Miri asks, I never feel I'm using the right choice to turn a word into the feminine or to work back from the feminine word to the proper masculine form. How do they decide to form the feminine word of the word ganzal? It's very simple, Miri, because that's the mishkal, right? It becomes either ganzarit or ganzeret, but it's probably ganzarit. And even if you make a mistake, Miri, it's perfectly all right to make a mistake in Hebrew. This is a brand new word. It is 8 days off the shelf. Native Hebrew speakers are going to mess up with the words, and they mess up with everyday words. That's why the Academy exists. The amount of times the Academy will reprimand people on social media for incorrectly conjugating a verb is endless. And that's towards native Hebrew speakers, not to Hebrew learners. Okay, so don't overthink this. Ganzal, ganzarit, or ganzeret. It's ganzarit, but if you say the wrong thing, you say the wrong thing. It's perfectly all right. Everyone's going to understand you. But it's conditioned on the word ganzal being understood by the population. Again, this word is 8 days old. Don't expect everyone in Israel, all 9 million here, plus all the millions of Hebrew speakers around the world, to already know this word. It just came out. Language acquisition takes decades, centuries, millennia to take place. So don't worry. Sheila asked, just for clarification, people have been using the English words in Hebrew and these words are being introduced to switch over and away from the other words? Absolutely, Sheila. The whole point of this is to have a Hebrew language that is full of Hebrew words, right? So instead of saying pacifism, which is not a Hebrew word, you can say shlomanut. Okay. Stuart, what's the Academy's website? You can look it up on Google, the Academy for Hebrew Language, but we will add the link on the YouTube recording of this in the next few days. So don't worry if you don't get it now, we'll add it there as well. Okay. Okay, any last questions about this lesson? You have just a few minutes to write in the Q&A, not in the chat. Okay, with that, we are going to wrap up now. Toda rabah, thank you all so much for joining, always. Again, this lesson will be up in the next few days on YouTube. You can follow it there if you didn't follow along here or you'd like to review. Along with all of our previous lessons, we'll also be sure to add the links to the Academy for the Hebrew Language and one of those guides to the various mishkalim that are out there. If you have any suggestions, requests for future topics, please write to us at Nefesh B'Nefesh. Otherwise, until next week, 8 p.m. Israel time. Toda rabah. Thank you all, and lehitrot. See you all very soon.